The afternoon light was golden, glinting off the long branches of the magnolia trees as I turned into Cormac's driveway. The warm breeze carried the scent of hickory smoke and the faint sweetness of blooming azaleas. I gripped the steering wheel for a few extra seconds after putting the car in park. My reflection in the rearview mirror was that of a woman I barely recognized. Tidy hair, a pressed black dress, and eyes that hadn't caught up with the fact that a week had already passed since my husband's funeral. I didn't want to be here, but in Savannah, not showing up for a family gathering after a death would draw more questions than my presence would. "It's good to be with family," my mother-in-law had said on the phone, though her tone suggested it was less about comfort and more about maintaining appearances. When I stepped out, gravel crunched under my heels. The sounds of laughter floated from the backyard, mixed with the rhythmic hum of conversation and the clink of ice in tall glasses. A few guests glanced over from the porch, offering the kind of polite nods that lasted half a second too long. Inside, the kitchen was busy with bodies moving in practiced choreography, someone slicing pie, another rearranging platters of cornbread and ribs. The air was heavy with the smell of smoked meat and sweet tea. At the sliding doors stood Cormac Bellamy, my brother-in-law, looking entirely at home in the role of host. He spotted me and offered a smile that was technically correct, but missing the warmth to make it real. "Glad you made it, Allarice," he said, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. I returned the courtesy, my words smooth but guarded, and followed the noise into the backyard. The yard was dressed for celebration, red checkered tablecloths, strings of Edison bulbs overhead, children weaving between the legs of folding chairs. It was a picture-perfect Southern gathering, and entirely wrong for the moment I was in. 1 week ago, I'd been standing in black beside a casket. Now I was expected to sip tea and smile as if nothing had shifted under my feet. I found a seat at the far end of a long table, half in shadow. Conversations continued around me without invitation. People approached to say the obligatory things. "It's good to see you out again. You've been through so much. Time to move forward." Phrases that sounded like they'd been pulled from a polite society handbook. A woman in a floral dress leaned down as she passed. "You must be relieved to get out of the house," she said brightly, not pausing for an answer. Across the yard, Cormac worked the crowd, clasping shoulders, laughing at jokes. Every so often, his gaze drifted toward me, measuring. It was subtle, but I recognized the shape of it. This wasn't only about grilled ribs and potato salad. It was my husband who used to say, "You see the truth about people when the stakes get high." The words came back to me now, uninvited but fitting. I sipped from my cup and let my eyes sweep the crowd. A cousin, seated 2 chairs down, leaned toward his wife and said, "Cormac's really keeping the place in order now. Looks better already." His wife glanced at me quickly, then back to him, murmuring agreement. Romilly, Cormac's wife, floated past carrying a plate of brownies. "Make sure you grab one before they're gone," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I tried joining a conversation about the upcoming council elections, only to have the group shift, so my voice landed at the edge. The topic pivoted to vacation plans, leaving me outside the circle. From the grill, Cormac's voice carried, "Finally got that fence done, right?" Took a little initiative. He looked my way briefly, the corner of his mouth twitching. The laugh that followed from the group around him wasn't loud, but it was enough. The fence had been my husband's project, slow maybe, but his. The jab was small, calculated, and noticed by more than just me. I kept my expression steady, the kind of neutral that makes people underestimate you. As the evening crept on, I started noticing other changes. The set of garden chairs my husband and I picked out together was gone, replaced with newer ones. The tool shed door was open, and inside, the shelves looked reorganized. In the kitchen, his collection of coffee mugs had been moved to a high shelf, out of daily reach. Cormac stood with a group near the grill, gesturing toward the house. "We're making a few updates," he said, as if the decision were his alone. "Just trying to make the place more functional." A neighbor stopped to greet me. "So, you're still staying here for now?" she asked casually, as if it were already decided that I wouldn't be. I managed a polite nod, but inside the words lodged like a burr. Still staying. Temporary. That was the message underneath. Cormac caught my eye from across the yard, raising his glass. The string lights above flickered faintly in the dusk, casting everyone's face in warm light. My chest tightened, not from grief this time, but from the steady awareness that something was about to happen. And then he tapped the side of his glass with a spoon, calling for everyone's attention. The clinking of Cormac's spoon against his wine glass rang out above the low hum of conversation, sharp enough to draw my eyes before the rest of me caught up. The chatter quieted in uneven ripples. People turned their heads, shifting in their seats, drinks poised mid-air. The smoke from the grill curled lazily upward, carrying the smell of charred ribs into the soft warmth of the Georgia evening. I stayed where I was, my hands loosely folded around my plastic cup, but a knot had already formed low in my stomach. Cormac stood near the center of the yard, backlit by the glow of the Edison bulbs strung overhead. Romilly was at his side, her expression neutral in the way only practiced spouses manage, present, supportive, but betraying nothing. My mind sifted through possibilities. Maybe he'd toast to family, thank everyone for coming. But the way his gaze kept landing on me, deliberate and unhurried, made the air feel heavy. This won't just be a toast, I thought. He waited until the last pockets of conversation died, then smiled broadly, turning slightly so he could take in the entire group. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "It means a lot, especially after, well, the past week." A few heads nodded, and there was a murmur of agreement. It's been a time for reflection, for thinking about what really matters: family, health, making the most of what we have. He paused, scanning faces, and I caught the faintest glint in his eye before the words came. "And with that in mind," he said, "I've decided that Allarice's room will be converted into my personal gym." It landed like a slap, so fast, so casual, that for a split second I thought I'd misheard. The silence that followed was jagged. Then came a few awkward chuckles, the kind people give when they aren't sure if something is a joke. "Are you serious?" someone near the grill asked. "Well, that's different," another voice chimed in, drawn out in that way Southerners have of stretching a word until it covers their discomfort. I sat still, my back straight, willing my face into a calm mask. Inside, a heat was building, half disbelief, half the cold knowledge that this wasn't impulsive. Romilly's subtle nod at his side told me this had been discussed, agreed upon, prepared. Across the yard, I caught snippets. "Guess she won't be here long." "About time someone used that space." People avoided my eyes, focusing on their plates or the condensation sliding down their cups. Cormac didn't look at me again. He didn't have to. The humiliation was already doing its work. I let my gaze sweep the crowd, looking for a lifeline. An older cousin met my eyes, then quickly turned to refill his drink. The woman who'd once told me I was like a sister to her leaned into her husband's shoulder, whispering something I couldn't hear. Romilly's smile stayed fixed, warm enough to seem pleasant, but empty of anything real. It was in that moment I understood no one was going to step in. Not because they agreed, necessarily, but because speaking up would be messy. It might mean taking sides. Better for them to let the moment pass and deal with whatever came later. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. I remembered reading once. Maya Angelou's words lodged somewhere in my memory. Tonight, they felt less like advice and more like confirmation. Shock was giving way to something steadier. Anger, yes, but controlled. The kind of anger that doesn't rush in swinging, but takes its time, watching, storing details for later. I let a few beats of silence stretch, then lifted my own cup, tapping it lightly with my finger. The sound was soft, but enough for those nearby to glance over. I offered Cormac the thinnest of smiles and gave a small nod, as if we'd just agreed on something amicable. Then I stood, stepping away from the table without a word. Romilly intercepted me near the porch steps. "You understand, right?" she said, her tone low, almost confidential. "Understand what, exactly?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "That this is about moving forward, new energy in the house. It's nothing personal." I looked at her for a long second, then smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just enough to make her step back. If you say so. She turned before I could see her reaction, disappearing into the crowd with the ease of someone who knew when to make an exit. Inside, the house was quieter. The faint music from outside was muffled through the walls. I walked the hallway toward my room, the familiar carpet soft under my feet. As I reached the doorway, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, I saw the edge of a cardboard box, and beyond it, a small pile of folded linens I didn't recognize. The air in the room felt disturbed, as if someone had been moving through it recently. It hit me then. This wasn't a plan for some vague future. It had already begun. I stood in the hallway, the muted laughter from the backyard muffled by the walls, staring at the half-open door to my room. That box I'd glimpsed from the corner, its cardboard edges dented, the flaps not quite meeting, sat like an intruder in my space. I pushed the door open with my fingertips. The fading sunlight slipped through the sheer curtains, striping the carpet in soft gold and shadow. The air smelled faintly of cedar polish and, under that, a trace of my husband's cologne, woodsy, warm, and heartbreakingly familiar. Dust motes floated lazily, disturbed by whoever had been in here without me. I noticed drawers slightly ajar, the quilt on the bed folded differently than I'd left it. This wasn't just a bedroom, it was the last corner of my life with him that hadn't been disturbed since the funeral. Every book on the shelf, every photo frame, every knick-knack on the dresser had a place because we had put it there together. Now, with strangers outside holding drinks and pretending nothing had changed, I was looking at evidence that something had. I closed the door behind me, the click of the latch louder than I intended. My pulse was steady, but my jaw ached from holding back words that wanted out. The room still held the shape of our life. On the dresser, a photo of our wedding day, me in lace, him in a navy suit, both of us laughing at something the photographer had said, leaned against the mirror. Books we had read together were stacked neatly. His favorite leather chair sat angled toward the window, the blanket he used to pull over his legs folded across its arm. At the foot of the bed stood the cedar chest. He had bought it from a craftsman in town, the same year we moved here. I knelt beside it, running my fingers along the smooth lid. Inside was the core of our shared history, his letters, our insurance documents, property deeds, the will. I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were next to me. Everything important is in here. If anything happens to me, don't let it out of your sight. Losing this room would be more than losing a place to sleep. It would mean surrendering the only physical proof left of what we had built together, and the legal protection I might one day need. I took the key from its spot on the nightstand, slid it into the lock, and turned it until the click sounded. The lid lifted smoothly. I checked each bundle of documents, each envelope in its place. Then I locked it again and slipped the key into the inside pocket of my dress. I'd read about widows blindsided by property disputes, how quickly shared became theirs in other people's eyes. Now I was living it. Stepping toward the doorway, I caught sight of another box in the hall. This one was full, items tossed in without care, framed photos, greeting cards, even our wedding invitation, the edges curling slightly. I knelt, sifting through. One frame held a picture from Tybee Island, him in rolled-up jeans, me barefoot in the sand, both of us squinting into the wind. The glass was cracked diagonally across our faces. A sharp pang rose in my chest. These weren't just things, they were markers of a life, demoted now to clutter. I imagined Cormac or someone he'd enlisted deciding what belonged and what didn't, reducing our years together to a pile in a hallway. I wanted to storm outside, demand answers, make them feel the weight of what they'd done. But I knew that would serve them more than me. Timing mattered. Power was in choosing when to speak. I lifted the Tybee Island photo from the box, cradling it carefully despite the broken glass. My husband used to tease me about keeping too many sentimental things, laughing as he said it. They're mine to keep, I thought, hearing my own silent reply. One by one, I carried the items back into the room, setting them gently where they had been. It was a small act, but deliberate, a way of reclaiming what they'd tried to strip from me. The sun had dipped lower, shadows pooling in the corners. I stood in the middle of the room, my hands resting on the cedar chest, and let my thoughts sharpen into something closer to resolve. This wasn't about a room anymore. It was about the erasure of my place in this house, in this family. I remembered something a neighbor once told me. The first step to losing something is believing you have no right to keep it. I would not make that mistake. From the yard came the muffled sound of Cormac's voice, followed by laughter. "Already halfway cleared," he said. My fingers closed tight around the key in my pocket. That was the moment I decided he wouldn't get another inch without a fight. 2 days after the barbecue, the house was deceptively quiet. Outside, the afternoon air was thick with that sticky savanna humidity, the kind that made you move slower without realizing it. I'd been keeping to myself, deliberately keeping my head down while I recalibrated. My mornings had been a pattern. Coffee brewed in the kitchen before anyone else was awake. A quiet walk through the garden to check the plants, then back to my room to sort through files and correspondence. The rhythm gave me the illusion of control. That illusion ended with a soft but deliberate knock at my bedroom door. I crossed the room, half expecting Romilly or one of the nieces. Instead, no one stood there. Just an envelope slid halfway under the door, the crisp edge catching against the carpet. I hesitated before picking it up. Paper had weight beyond ounces when you suspected it carried bad news. I turned it over. No handwriting, just my name printed in block letters. The flap was sealed, the kind of firm press you give when you're making sure something stays closed. Sitting at my desk, I slid a letter opener under the fold. Even before I read the first line, my gut told me this would not be a casual note. "Dear Allarice," it began, the tone formal enough to pass for business correspondence. He wrote about recent discussions and optimizing shared household spaces for the benefit of all occupants. In the second paragraph came the core. I had 1 week to relocate my personal belongings from my room so that the conversion project could commence. He wrapped it in polite language as if that softened the blow. Phrases about family harmony and best use of resources. At the bottom, scrawled in pen, were 5 words. "Let's keep this civil." My chest tightened. My hands were steady enough to hold the paper, but I could feel the pulse in my fingers. I read it again, slower this time, parsing every phrase for what it really meant. This was no request. It was an ultimatum designed to set a clock running in my head. The letter wasn't about a room. It was about removing my claim to this house, about rebranding me as a guest with an expiration date. I folded it neatly, even though I wanted to tear it in half, and walked to the cedar chest. The lock clicked under my hand, the wood creaking slightly as it opened. I slid the letter into a folder with the other important papers, insurance, property records, and now, evidence of intent. In the widows group I'd joined online, women always said, "Document everything. Keep copies, keep timestamps, keep the paper trail neat enough to hand to an attorney if you ever need to." Closing the chest, I pressed my palm flat on the lid for a moment. This was the first real move in what I was starting to recognize as a deliberate campaign. By late afternoon, I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard voices drifting from the dining room. Cormac's tone carried that particular volume meant to reach unintended ears. "She doesn't contribute to household expenses anymore," he was telling his uncle, a man I'd seen twice in the last year. "What's she really entitled to?" The words were slow, measured, just enough emphasis to plant doubt. The uncle made a non-committal noise, and Cormac kept going, talking about rising utility costs, upkeep, and dead space in the house. The tea kettle hissed behind me. I kept my back to them, my grip on the counter firm enough to leave my knuckles pale. The sting wasn't in the claim, it was in the intentional performance of it, designed to rewrite the story of my place here. Humiliation flickered, but anger steadied me. I ran the math in my head. How many months I'd paid the electric bill outright, the renovations I'd bankrolled when the roof leaked, the groceries I stocked when Romilly's busy season at work left her unavailable. The sum of those contributions far outweighed what Cormac had ever acknowledged. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. Eleanor Roosevelt's words came to me, crisp and useful in the moment. I set the kettle down quietly. Walking past the dining room, I didn't look at either of them, but I let my expression be the kind of neutral that makes people uneasy. Silence can be louder than outrage when you use it right. The rest of the day I kept to myself. My room became my office, my war room. I pulled out a notebook and began a new section. Dates, times, brief descriptions of interactions. I noted the letter's delivery, the overheard conversation, the exact words used. That evening, I called a friend outside the family. I might need legal advice sooner rather than later, I told her. She didn't ask for details, just said, "Let me know when you're ready. I know someone discreet." Before bed, I added a reminder to speak with Harlan. He knew the details of the will better than anyone, and I needed confirmation in writing. As I turned the key in my bedroom door, the hallway was dim, shadows stretching along the walls. From somewhere near the stairs, Cormac's voice reached me, low but clear enough. "1 week, Allarice. Don't make me make it ugly." I closed the door slowly, my hand firm on the knob. He wasn't bluffing. He was daring me to push back. The morning after Cormac's ultimatum, I was awake before the light had fully settled over the magnolias. I lay there for a moment, the edges of sleep still clinging, replaying the words from yesterday like they'd been etched into the walls. 1 week, Allarice. Don't make me make it ugly. I sat up slowly, feet touching the floor, and drew in a long breath. My mind cycled through the humiliation of him saying it, the calculated volume so anyone passing might hear. But dwelling on that wouldn't keep my footing here. Protecting what mattered would. The house was unusually quiet. No sound of Romilly's heels crossing the hallway, no low hum of Cormac's voice carrying from the kitchen. I peeked through the blinds. Both of their cars were gone, an opening. I decided to take advantage of it, moving freely without having to measure my steps around them. In the stillness, every creak of the floor seemed louder, every tick of the hallway clock sharper. On my way to the kitchen, I noticed Cormac's laptop bag on the dining table, the flap unbuckled, a handful of papers sticking out. I don't snoop for sport, but something about the careless placement, the way those documents fanned like an invitation, made me stop. One page caught my eye. Bold black letters in the subject line, preliminary offer, closing timeline. I pulled it free. The email thread was printed in neat columns. My eyes skimmed the sender, a realtor I vaguely recognized from a yard sign downtown. The messages were dated over the past month. There were references to serious interest from the buyer, inspection schedule, and tentative closing in 6 weeks. A slow, deliberate breath left me. This wasn't just about my room. The gym talk, the boxes, the pressure, it was a prelude. He'd been negotiating to sell the entire property, and based on the phrasing, he was well past the talking stage. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but with it came a sharpened clarity. So, if he thought I'd walk quietly into this sale, he'd underestimated me. I laid the papers back exactly as they'd been, then pulled out my phone. With steady hands, I photographed each page, checking the clarity before slipping them back into the stack. In my mind, I saw other women from the widows group, their posts about siblings-in-law liquidating family homes before the widow even had time to catch her breath. Those stories had felt distant before. Now they were mine. I put the phone in my pocket and poured coffee, the bitterness grounding me. By early afternoon, I was seated across from Harlan Crowder at a corner table in a quiet coffee shop downtown. Harlan had been my husband's closest friend since college, a man who knew the ins and outs of his affairs better than anyone. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a level look, the kind people give when they already suspect why you've called. "What's going on?" he asked, leaning forward. I told him everything. The barbecue, the public gym announcement, the ultimatum, and finally, the documents I'd found that morning. His brow furrowed deeper with each detail. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "There's something you need to know," he said. "Your husband left you a life estate in this house." The words landed like a sudden lift in weight, but I gripped my mug tighter, cautious. "A life estate? It means," Harlan said, "you have the legal right to live there for the rest of your life. It's in the will. It's ironclad. He can't force you out, and he can't sell the property without your agreement." Relief rushed in, but it wasn't pure. It was laced with the realization that Cormac might already know this, and that his pressure campaign was meant to make me leave before I ever invoked it. Harlan continued, I can get you a certified copy from the attorney who handled the estate, and you need to take it to a lawyer of your own. Quietly. Don't tip him off that you know. I looked down at my coffee, the steam curling up between us. My husband's foresight felt like a hand on my shoulder, a reminder that even now, he'd tried to protect me. This document wasn't just legal leverage, it was an anchor in the storm. We agreed to keep our meeting discreet. No calls to the house phone, no emails that could be intercepted. Harlan would reach out in 2 days with the certified copy. Walking back to my car, I felt a steadiness I hadn't in days. The fight wasn't over, but I had footing now. When I got home, Cormac's car was still absent from the driveway. I went straight to my room, locked the door, and opened the cedar chest. The phone went in first, then a manila folder I labeled for attorney. Inside, I placed the photos of the printed emails and a note detailing what Harlan had told me. The battle over my room had just been reframed. It wasn't a corner of the house at stake, it was the house itself, and my right to remain. By the time I heard the crunch of tires in the driveway, the folder was back in the chest, the key in my pocket. I stepped into the hallway just as Cormac came in. He didn't look my way, but I caught the faintest smirk as he passed toward the kitchen. Later, as I headed to my room for the night, I noticed the door ajar. From inside came the low scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. That was when I realized the room wasn't just under threat. It was under siege. The scraping sound was steady, deliberate, like something heavy being dragged over wood. My hand tightened around the strap of my bag, feeling the hard outline of my phone and the small metal key to the cedar chest pressing against the fabric. I moved down the hallway, each step slow, my breath shallow but measured. The late afternoon sun spilled through the side windows, long strips of gold light cutting across the floorboards. My heart beat heavier the closer I got to the open door of my room. I pushed it open with my fingertips. There they were, Cormac and a man I didn't recognize, mid-40s, wiry, wearing paint-smeared work pants. The two of them were maneuvering a treadmill through the doorway, its steel frame catching on the jamb. The smell of cold metal and new rubber was sharp against the familiar air of my room. Dust floated lazily where furniture had been shifted. Cormac looked up, smiling like this was a perfectly ordinary afternoon. Just getting a head start, he said, his voice easy, casual. The handyman avoided my eyes entirely, focusing on angling the treadmill past my dresser. I stepped inside, leaning against the doorframe, saying nothing. Silence makes some people hurry their words. I wanted to see if Cormac was one of them. Once this is in place, I'll have the mirrors along that wall, he went on, gesturing toward the space where my husband's leather chair had been. We'll repaint, something bright, maybe white, so the light bounces. He turned, scanning the rest of the room like a contractor making mental notes. Every sentence was an erasure. My things, my history, reduced to obstacles in his vision. I let my eyes rest on the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. It had been moved a few inches from its place against the frame. Not enough for him to open it, not without the key, but enough to send a message. Nothing here is untouchable. Interesting choice, I said finally, my tone flat. Cormac smiled again, broader this time. Just trying to make the best use of space. You'll appreciate it later. I didn't answer. My mind was already storing every detail, the brand of the treadmill, the way he described the alterations, the subtle displacement of my belongings. All of it would go in my records. The handyman muttered something about needing a wrench from the truck. Cormac followed him out, phone already in hand as he started a call. The hallway was empty. I turned to close the door and froze. The knob was new, shinier than the rest of the hardware in the house. I ran my fingers over it. A keyed entry lock, not the simple brass handle that had been there yesterday. A rush of realization. I'd been locked out before without knowing it. The only reason I'd gotten in now was because the door had been left ajar while they worked. If Cormac turned that key, I'd be shut out completely. I pulled my phone from my bag, snapping a clear photo of the lock and its brand. and then I stepped back to get the doorframe in the shot for context. The sting wasn't just about the metal and mechanism, it was about control, about who got to decide if I could enter the one space in this house that was still mine. My father used to say, "Locks aren't about keeping things safe, they're about deciding who's in and who's out." Standing there, I understood exactly what that meant. I didn't bother testing the keyhole. I knew my key wouldn't fit. Instead, I walked away, each step deliberate, holding back the urge to march into the kitchen and throw the new lock in his face. In my room, I opened my notebook, the one I'd started after the barbecue. Under the date, I wrote, "Gym equipment moved in while I was present. Cedar chest shifted, new keyed lock installed." Then I typed a short message to Harlan. "It's worse than we thought. Call me tonight." The pen hovered over the paper a moment before I added, "This isn't just about pressure. He's marking territory." I was halfway through organizing the photos and notes when my phone buzzed on the desk. No name, just a local number I didn't recognize. "Hope you're packing." Clock's ticking. No signature. None needed. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a name to know exactly who sent it. 2 days after the gym equipment incident, I found myself standing at the kitchen counter, pouring hot water over a tea bag when Cormac walked in. He had that practiced half-smile plastered on, the one he used when he wanted to look like the good guy in a story he was telling only to himself. "Morning," he said, his tone deliberately casual. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe you could use the gym too, for your health. Might be good for you to work through things." I kept my eyes on the steam rising from my mug. It sounded like an offer, but it felt like bait. Accepting would legitimize his claim that the space was his to give. Refusing would let him paint me as difficult. "That's generous," I said evenly, "but I'll pass. I've got my own routines." He leaned a hip against the counter. "It's just, I'm trying to include you. Make it a shared thing." I met his gaze, holding it until the silence made him shift his weight. "I appreciate the thought," I said, "but no." I gave him nothing to twist, no tone, no visible irritation, just a polite boundary he couldn't misquote. For the first time in days, his smile faltered. He gave a little shrug and left the kitchen without another word. By mid-afternoon, I understood why he'd tried to set the stage. I overheard Mrs. Lafferty, our neighbor across the street, telling another neighbor at her mailbox, he's really trying to include her, offering her a place in the new gym. The irritation burned low in my gut. It wasn't just about the room anymore. This was about shaping the narrative. In a tight-knit community like ours, perception could be more powerful than paperwork. If he could paint himself as the magnanimous brother-in-law and me as the one refusing goodwill, he'd win sympathy before I even had a chance to speak. Mark Twain's words floated into my mind. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. I spent the rest of the afternoon quietly rewriting his story where I could. Small, strategic conversations with people I trusted, ones who would listen without rushing to repeat gossip. I didn't badmouth him outright. Instead, I planted facts, the kind that would stand on their own. That night, the sound started. Thumping bass lines, the metallic clank of weights hitting the floor, bursts of laughter spilling into the hallway. I glanced at the clock, 10:45 p.m. I closed my book, set it on the nightstand, and sat still, listening. This wasn't random noise. It was too sustained, too pointed, like a territorial animal marking space. Through the crack under my door, light flickered from the gym. I could picture the scene without seeing it. Cormac playing host, his friends encouraged to push harder, lift heavier, laugh louder. I pulled out my phone, opening the Notes app. 10:46 p.m., music audible in all rooms, multiple voices, weights dropped repeatedly. Then I set the phone to record, capturing the pounding beat and the crash of metal for a full minute before stopping. Part of me wanted to call the police and file a noise complaint, but that would give him the escalation he was waiting for. Instead, I texted a neighbor who'd mentioned the noise before. "If you hear this tonight, could you note the time?" She replied with a simple, "Already did." The noise didn't stop until well after 11:30. When it finally went quiet, the house felt different, like it had been claimed in some unspoken way. In the morning, I walked past the gym on my way to make coffee. The door was wide open, weights scattered haphazardly, a towel draped over my cedar chest like it was a spare bench. Disregard wasn't even hidden anymore. I pulled out my phone and sent a discreet message to Benedict. We need to meet soon, with Harlan. I have everything documented from BBQ to now. Back in my room, I laid out my notes, arranging them in order. The public announcement, the boxes, the ultimatum, the lock change, the noise campaign. Each entry had dates, times, and if possible, witnesses. As I was sliding a paperclip onto the last set of notes, a shadow moved under my door. Something thin scraped forward, a folded flyer. I picked it up and opened it. Bold letters announced, Community Fitness Open House, this Saturday in our new gym. The hour wasn't a mistake. It was a challenge, and I planned to answer it. By the time Saturday evening settled in, the street outside was lined with cars. From my bedroom window, I watched Cormac working the driveway like a politician at a campaign rally. He shook hands, clapped backs, and laughed in that broad, chesty way that carried over the hum of conversation. One by one, neighbors and acquaintances filed toward the backyard, drawn by the promise of the Community Fitness Open House. Through the glass, I could see him leading the first group inside, gesturing grandly toward the converted space. I imagined the tour, the treadmill positioned proudly, mirrors gleaming under overhead lights, my cedar chest shoved into some corner like an afterthought. Each nod of approval, each polite chuckle at his jokes, would cement his image as the generous renovator, the one investing in family property for everyone's benefit. I stayed where I was, the curtain just slightly parted, my mind calm in a way it hadn't been for weeks. Tonight was his performance, but it was also my stage. I wouldn't disrupt his show in front of his audience. That would be his game. Mine was to move pieces quietly while the music played. The past week had been one long act of gathering, photographs of the gym equipment arriving, videos of late-night noise spilling into the hall, notes about the lock change, every overheard comment recorded with times and witnesses. It was all in order now, stacked in a neat folder in my bag, the kind of evidence you hand over when you're ready to stop being on defense. While the crowd's attention was locked on Cormac's tour, I slipped out the side door, down the steps, and across the driveway where Benedict and Harlan waited near Harlan's car. Benedict, always precise, opened the rear door for me like we were meeting for a business call. "Is this everything?" he asked quietly. "All of it," I said, handing him the folder. "If he tries to lock me out tonight, nothing's lost." Harlan glanced toward the house. "You're doing the right thing," he murmured. "Let him play his part in front of the neighbors. Tonight, you play the long game." I nodded, the weight in my chest shifting. Not lighter, but more controlled. "Keep it safe," I said, and stepped back toward the yard, where the smell of grilled chicken and cologne drifted on the breeze. Inside, I moved through the rooms with an ease that belied the current under my skin. I smiled when greeted, asked after someone's grandchild, nodded through stories. All the while, I watched Cormac out of the corner of my eye, tracking his path, noting who he lingered with and whose ear he bent longer. In my pocket, the small USB drive pressed against my palm like a talisman. I'd found it 3 days ago, tucked in the false bottom of my husband's desk drawer. At first, I'd almost ignored it, another stray tech piece. But when I opened it last night, the screen filled with scanned documents, the will, property records, and a life insurance clause naming me as sole beneficiary and holder of a life estate in the house. It was more than evidence. It was my trump card. Running my thumb over its smooth edge now, I felt something deeper than relief. It was as if my husband's voice was in the room, steadying me, telling me he'd thought ahead, because he knew people like Cormac. "I'm not leaving," I whispered under my breath, my lips barely moving. "Not now. Not ever." I made a slow circuit back to the kitchen, where a group had gathered for drinks. Cormac's laughter cut through the room, the sound just a little too loud for the size of the gathering. He was in his element. I was in mine. As the night wound down, guests began to drift toward the door, their voices mellow from food and drink. I positioned myself near the hallway that led to the front, leaning casually against the wall. There was only one way out for him, and it passed right by me. When he came into view, saying his goodbyes with that same easy charm, I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just waited until he was close enough to hear me without anyone else catching the words. "We need to talk," I said evenly. "Soon." For the first time that night, his smile faltered, a small hitch in the mask. His eyes searched mine, looking for the edge of what I knew. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I simply stepped aside, letting him pass. And that was when I saw it. The first crack in his confidence. By the time Saturday evening arrived, the street outside was lined with unfamiliar cars. I stood back from my bedroom window, the curtain barely moved, watching Cormac stand in the driveway greeting each arrival like the host of a garden party. He laughed loudly, shook hands with long, two-handed grips, slapped shoulders. Neighbors I hadn't seen in years came carrying covered dishes, balancing coolers, stepping into the backyard where the glow from the string lights and the smell of grilled meat would do most of the work for him. From here, I could see the path through the house, the way guests were funneled toward the new gym like it was some grand unveiling. I knew how he'd sell it, talk about revitalizing the property, about making good use of space, and make sure to stand exactly where the light caught the treadmill's chrome frame. Every handshake and every polite laugh cemented his version of events. Cormac as the generous brother-in-law, investing in the family home. I knew better, but tonight wasn't for contradicting him in front of his audience. Tonight was for my own move, quieter but sharper. The past week had been my gathering phase. Photographs of boxes in the hallway, videos of the midnight noise from the so-called gym, the new lock on my door, the neighbors' whispered accounts, all cataloged with dates and times. It was all here, printed, labeled, organized in a neat folder. A case file in every sense of the word. When I heard the noise from the backyard rise, the chorus of greetings as another cluster arrived, I slipped out the side door. The air was cool against my skin as I crossed the drive to where Benedict's sedan idled under the shade of the old oak. Harlan was there too, leaning against the passenger side. "This is everything?" Benedict asked quietly, his hand already outstretched. "All of it," I said, passing the folder across. "If he tries to lock me out tonight, at least this won't be lost." Harlan's eyes went to the folder, then back to me. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "Let him have his open house. You just make sure you own the closing act." I gave them both a small nod and stepped back toward the porch, blending into the hum of the evening. My pulse slowed with each step. Evidence secured meant I could focus on the other card I carried. In my pocket was the small USB drive I'd found days ago, hidden under the false bottom of my husband's desk drawer. I'd almost overlooked it, assuming it was some outdated thumb drive left from his office days. But last night, curiosity, or maybe instinct, made me plug it in. The screen filled with scanned documents, the will, property records, a life insurance policy. And in the middle of the will, clear as day, was the clause Harlan had told me about. The life estate giving me the right to live in this house for the rest of my life. There was no mistaking it, no room for interpretation. Holding it now, the smooth plastic warm from my palm, it felt heavier than its size allowed. It was more than a document. It was my anchor, proof my husband had seen further than I had, that he'd anticipated storms like this. "I'm not leaving," I whispered under my breath as I stepped back inside. "Not now. Not ever." I moved through the living room, smiling just enough at familiar faces, answering questions about work, about how I'd been holding up. My eyes stayed alert, scanning for Cormac, noting where he was, who he was talking to, how often he glanced my way. Every so often, I caught fragments from the gym, state-of-the-art, open to the family, just trying to make this place better. The guests nodded, the story taking root exactly as he wanted. Let him tell it. Stories can change in a heartbeat if you drop the right truth at the right moment. As the night began to thin, guests started making their rounds for goodbyes. I positioned myself in the hallway leading toward the front door. There was only one way out for Cormac, and it passed directly by me. When he finally appeared, he was in mid-conversation, his smile broad, his hand on the shoulder of one of the neighbors. I waited until he was close enough that my words wouldn't carry to anyone else. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady, almost casual. His smile faltered. A flicker, but enough. For the first time all night, he searched my eyes instead of the crowd. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. And that was when I saw it. The first crack in his confidence. Cormac called it a family meeting, his tone in the group text sounding like this was just another household update. Nothing urgent. But I knew better. He wanted to gather them before I could. When I walked into the formal dining room the next morning, the air was already tight. The long mahogany table was set with coffee cups and a plate of untouched muffins in the center. Family members were seated on both sides, eyes flicking between me and Cormac. Romilly sat to his right, hands folded neatly, her gaze fixed on a spot just past my shoulder. I'd come prepared. In my bag, a printed copy of the will, the USB drive, Fayard's written statement, and the letter from my husband. My phone was ready too, voice recorder open just in case. Cormac sat at the head of the table, his posture straight, chin slightly lifted, as if the seat itself conferred authority. He glanced around, tapping his fingers on the table in that practiced, measured way of someone about to deliver big news. But before he could start, I placed a sealed envelope on the table in front of me. His eyes flicked down to it, then back to my face. This, I said, sliding it forward, is from my husband, his handwriting, his words. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter carefully, letting the paper rest in my hands like something fragile. Clearing my throat, I began to read aloud. Allarice, if you're holding this, it means I can't tell you these things myself. I want you to remain in this house for as long as you wish, for the rest of your life, if that's what you choose. I trust you to protect what we built together. I worry that after I'm gone, there will be pressure from others. Don't let that pressure move you. This is your home. The room shifted. A few people leaned back in their chairs, others stared at the table. I caught Romilly's eyes drop for the first time since I'd entered. I continued, my voice steady. He left this in the cedar chest. I didn't open it until now because I wanted to be sure there was no misunderstanding about his intentions. This is touching, Allarice, Cormac said, his voice smooth but tighter than usual. But I'm not finished, I said, looking straight at him. From my bag, I took out the USB drive and placed it next to the letter. On here are scanned copies of the will, the property records, and the life insurance policy. The will contains a life estate clause, granting me the legal right to live here for the rest of my life. Benedict, seated halfway down the table, cleared his throat and spoke. I've reviewed the documents personally. They are valid and enforceable. The life estate is clear. Mr. Quinlan cannot sell, transfer, or otherwise remove Mrs. Quinlan from this property without her consent. I let the words hang. The silence was heavier this time. I pulled out Fayard's statement and set it down in front of Benedict. This is from our neighbor. She overheard Cormac discussing plans to sell the property and referring to my removal as a given. Benedict glanced at it, then looked directly at Cormac. This statement, combined with the will, makes any attempt to sell without Mrs. Quinlan's agreement actionable. Murmurs rippled down the table. One uncle shifted uncomfortably, and an aunt who'd barely spoken all year suddenly found the muffin tray fascinating. I leaned forward, my voice calm but resolute. I am not leaving. This is my home, and that is the end of the discussion. Cormac's jaw worked. He opened his mouth, then closed it again before speaking. We have to think about what's best for the family. This is best for the family, I said evenly. Keeping the promises made. Respecting the person who built this home with me. He looked around for support, but the room had gone quiet in that way people do when they've chosen a side without saying it out loud. Romilly's gaze stayed on her lap. His big news never came. Whatever speech he'd prepared was gone, replaced by a brittle smile as he leaned back in his chair. If that's how you want it. It's how it is, I replied. The meeting ended without ceremony. Chairs scraped back, coffee cups clinked, and people filed out in pairs, speaking quietly. As the last of them left, Cormac walked past me, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of his aftershave. This isn't over, he muttered. For you, maybe, I said softly, meeting his eyes. For me, it was the beginning of something better. A week had passed since the confrontation in the dining room, and the house had settled into a different kind of quiet. It wasn't peace. Peace implies warmth, mutual understanding. This was simply an absence of open conflict, the air still thick with things unsaid. The tension had dulled from a sharp sting to a steady hum, always there in the background. Cormac kept his distance. I'd hear his footsteps in the hall or the thud of a door closing somewhere else in the house, but he never lingered in the same room. He poured his energy into projects outside, clearing brush along the back fence, rearranging tools in the garage. Romilly, for her part, remained unfailingly polite but cool, her small talk about weather and grocery lists calculated to avoid anything real. Victory felt good, but it didn't taste sweet. I understood now that holding my ground had cost me whatever was left of the illusion of family unity, and that was fine. Sometimes, independence means letting go of the belief that shared blood or shared property guarantees loyalty. The news had spread quickly. Savannah has a way of passing stories without anyone admitting they're gossiping. Neighbors waved at me with a warmth I hadn't felt in months, stopping to ask how I was doing, sliding in quiet comments like, "Good for you, standing your ground." It was clear Cormac's standing had taken a hit. The property sale he'd been arranging evaporated after word of my life estate made its way through the right channels. Whatever promises he'd made to that buyer were now just awkward silences. At the farmer's market on Saturday, I watched one of his old friends, someone he used to fish with every spring, walk right past him without so much as a nod. There was a certain justice in it. Not the dramatic kind you see in courtrooms, but the quiet, everyday kind where someone's own actions circle back to meet them. I thought of Martin Luther King Jr.'s words. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." I could feel that bend now. Inside the house, I reclaimed my space. My room was no longer half gym, half battlefield. I moved my husband's leather chair back near the window, added a small writing desk in the corner, and polished the cedar chest until it shone. The lock clicked with a satisfying certainty each time I closed it. I began a habit, one I hadn't done since he passed, of writing him letters. They weren't about grief anymore, but about where I was, what I'd learned, and the small victories I knew he'd appreciate. Some nights I'd sit at the desk, pen in hand, and realize I was smiling while writing about the day's progress. One afternoon, while dusting the bookshelf, I found an old photo of us from our first year in the house, standing in front of the magnolia tree we'd planted together. It reminded me why I was still here, not just because of a legal clause, but because this place held the history of two lives intertwined. The thought stayed with me when I reached out to a couple of women from the Widows Support Group. Over coffee, we talked about starting a small network for widows dealing with housing disputes, sharing resources, strategies, and sometimes just a sympathetic ear. The idea lit something in me. For the first time in months, satisfaction didn't feel like a defensive shield. It felt like a foundation. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something new on my own terms. I knew the dynamic with Cormac and Romilly would never be fixed. That was no longer the goal. I was at peace with the distance. My energy was better spent on what I could control. One morning, as sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, I sketched out plans to renovate the unused upstairs bedroom into a rental suite. It would bring in steady income, keep me financially independent, and ensure I maintained control over who lived under this roof. My worth would never again be defined by someone else's approval. That afternoon, the mail arrived. I sorted through the usual, flyers, bills, a seed catalog, until I reached an envelope addressed in an unfamiliar, looping hand. No return address. I slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a single piece of paper. "We need to talk about what he told me before he died." I read it twice, the words settling over me with a weight I hadn't expected. And just like that, I knew the story wasn't over. The envelope from the week before sat on my desk like a quiet bell, something that had already rung and was still vibrating in the air. I opened it carefully, smoothing the page against the wood. The letter was from Cal Whitner, an old fishing buddy of my husband's, a man with sun-leathered hands and the patient eyes of someone who knew tide tables better than calendars. He wrote in a plain, steady hand. Your husband worried that Cormac would move on you after the funeral. He asked me to make sure you knew about the box. If you haven't already, there's a safe deposit key wrapped in blue tape inside the cedar chest, tucked beneath the letters. The words found breath in me. Cal explained that, a month before my husband died, they'd driven to a downtown bank together. Cal had stood in the lobby while my husband put a second set of documents, a notarized letter, a certified copy of the will, and updated property papers, into box 312. Cal's line was simple and devastating. He said if anyone tried to push you out, these would be your backstop. Fear didn't follow that revelation. Power did, clean and bracing. I opened the cedar chest, lifted the envelope of letters, and felt for the key with blue tape. It was there, cool and unmistakable against my fingers. I whispered, "Thank you," unsure if I meant it for Cal, for my husband, or for the part of myself that had refused to shrink. 2 days later, after a quiet meeting at the bank with Benedict and Harlan witnessing the inventory, I had photocopies in triplicate and originals in a fireproof pouch. That was the last puzzle piece. It was time to end this. I invited Cormac and Romilly to the house on a Sunday afternoon, asked a few relatives who had sat at that long table during the family meeting, and called Cal to join us. No surprises, no secret doors, just a clear public conversation that no one could later recast as hysteria or misunderstanding. Cormac walked in with his shoulders rolled back, the same performance he always brought to a room, a small smile, the weatherman's tone. "So," he said, clapping his hands softly, "we're finally resolving this?" "We are," I answered. I'd set the living room like a conference, not a homey chat. Coffee table cleared, folders labeled by date, a legal pad for Benedict, a single vase of magnolia leaves to anchor the eye. If hospitality had once been used to smother me, today it would serve me. Romilly perched on the edge of the sofa, calm as a watercolor. 2 ants sat together, fingers linked, unsure of where this was going. Harlan leaned against the fireplace, silent, observant. Cal took a chair near the window, cap in his lap. I didn't start with speeches. I started with time. "From the barbecue to the changed lock," I said, sliding the first folder forward. "This is the record. Photos, logs, printed texts, the flyer that had declared a gym in our house, each page landing with a gentle, deliberate tap. I watched faces open and close like shutters. Cormac tried to keep up his easy tone. "We've already discussed much of this, Allarice. No need to." "We haven't discussed it with everyone here," I said. "And we haven't connected the dots." I lifted the second folder, the email chain about the potential sale. "You weren't converting a room. You were staging a sale." He lifted a palm, practiced. "Preliminary inquiries, nothing set in stone." "Correct," Benedict said, voice even, "because the legal foundation wouldn't allow it." I let the silence expand. Then I placed my husband's letter in the center of the table, the one in his hand, the one that felt like hearing him at the kitchen counter. I read, his wish that I remain in the house for life, his worry that family pressures might land on me when I was most vulnerable, his trust that I'd guard the home we'd built. Word by word, the room shifted. Ants dabbed at their eyes. Romilly's gaze wavered for the first time. Cal spoke up, voice soft but steady. He told me he loved this house because of her, said walls don't matter if the person inside is alone. Cormac exhaled through his nose, an old tell. "Letters are sentimental," he said, grasping for neutral ground. "This is a property question." "Then here's the property answer," I replied. I set the safe deposit pouch on the table, unzipped it, and slid out the certified will, the notarized letter, the updated record. The USB with digital scans lay beside them like a small, unblinking eye. "There are backups at the bank and with our counsel. These confirm, again, that I hold a life estate, not contingent, not temporary, not subject to your timeline." Benedict read the clause aloud, laying a yellow highlighter over the sentence granting me the right to occupy and control the property for my lifetime. He followed with the notice from the bank, documenting the chain of custody for the duplicates. It wasn't theatrical, It was diligent. And diligence, in a room used to bluster, is its own kind of thunder. Fayard's written statement came next. Handyman to your manipulations. His testimony described instructions to move equipment into my room, to swap the lock, to pressure the timeline. No raised voice could knock those words off the page. Cormac's composure began to fray at the edges. This is an ambush, he said, searching the faces that had once nodded along to his plans. I was trying to erase me, I said plainly. And not just from a room. My voice didn't lift. From the story. You wanted to recast this house and my place in it without me. Romilly's hand moved toward his sleeve and then stopped. One aunt murmured, My goodness. Which in our family is what you say when the floor gives a little. Benedict slid a final document across the table. A formal legal notice. From this day forward, any attempt to harass, threaten, lock out, or otherwise interfere with Ms. Quinlan's lawful occupancy will trigger immediate legal action, including injunctive relief and damages. You will be personally liable for costs. Cormac stared at the page, jaw set. So that's it, he said, the smile gone. It is, I answered. And there's more. I pulled out a small box of keys and placed them beside the documents. New locks, new security system. Your access is revoked. If you need to retrieve personal items, you'll schedule through counsel during the hours we agree to in writing. He laughed once, a short, disbelieving sound. You can't just... I can, I said, meeting his eyes. And I am... Preparation beats impulse, Cormac, every time. For a long beat, no one spoke. It wasn't silence so much as the sound of a room recalibrating. The power had moved, and everyone felt it, the way a thunderhead breaks and the pressure changes. Cal stood up, took his cap in hand, and nodded to me like a quiet benediction. He'd be proud, he said. This is what he was hoping you'd do. Cormac gathered himself, but the authority he'd worn for months lay on the table between the folders, empty of weight. He turned, and Romilly, after a moment's hesitation, followed. At the doorway, he paused and said, not to me, but to the wall, You'll regret making this ugly. For you, maybe, I said. For me, it's over. When the door closed, the house exhaled with me. The ants left in small clusters, pressing my hands, whispering apologies and encouragement. Benedict packed the documents with neat precision. Harlan checked the front cameras, walking me through the app again like a patient teacher. Cal lingered last, pointing to the magnolia tree outside. You keep pruning it like he did, he said. It'll bloom bigger next year. When everyone had gone, the late sunlight slid across the floorboards, turning them the color of warm honey. I walked the perimeter of the room, the same circuit I'd traced on the nights I couldn't sleep after the funeral. It felt different now, not lighter exactly, just mine. I brewed tea, carried it to the desk, and wrote the last of my letters. We did it. We set the bones right. I'm going to turn the back room into a space where widows can meet, share notes, swap strategies, drink coffee that's too strong. Your chair is by the window again. The key you hid was exactly where you said it would be. You always did like a simple plan that worked. It wasn't revenge that warmed me. It was repair. It was the decision not to hand my story to someone else because their voice was louder that day. In the weeks ahead, I'd move forward with the rental suite plans, coordinate the community group, and learn the practical rhythms of running a house that had, for a time, become a battleground. But tonight, I wanted only to stand in the quiet and recognize it for what it was, earned. At dusk, I walked to the front door. The new deadbolt clicked smoothly, a small, satisfying sound. I placed my palm on the wood, feeling the faint heartbeat of the house, the settling boards, the outside cicadas beginning their choir. This house will never be yours, I whispered, the words not a curse, but a benediction for myself. Then I turned the key with finality, stepped back, and let the night hold its peace.